Get ready to take a flamethrower to the official narrative and learn what the elites don't want you to know. You're listening to The Tom Woods Show.
Hey everybody, Tom Woods here. It's episode 2608 of The Tom Woods Show. And I got old Keith Knight back here with us. You might notice, by the way, that this week there are, I used to do 5 episodes a week of The Tom Woods Show. And then I thought, well, I'd rather do slightly longer ones that, but produce fewer of them. And because I just felt like that on balance was a better mix. So I started to do that. But last week I did only 2. They were a long story. And now I could have just moved on. I've produced over 2,600 of these. No one's going to notice if I miss one. But it's just the way I am, Keith. I'm doing 4 this week, to make up for it. So that on average, it's still 3 a week. So in any case anybody's confused about what's going on, it's because of your Tom Woods Show deficit last week that you have a surplus this week. Anyway, Keith Knight is managing editor at the LIbertarian Institute. And I want to talk to him about, one of our most maligned and yet at the same time most beloved and celebrated and accomplished and influential and important figures. And that is Hans-Hermann Hoppe, a name you've probably heard, whose books you probably, just going on averages here, probably have not read. But we all know him from the memes, basically. But that's about it. Anyway, Keith, welcome back. Great to have you.
Tom, thanks so much for having me and letting me on to talk about one of my intellectual heroes.
All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about the books. Now, Hans Hoppe is a polarizing figure. Polarizing. I think I probably first met him about over 30 years ago, actually. And one of the great things about in 2017, the 1000th episode of the Tom Woods Show, is that before I came out, we ran this montage of congratulatory messages from people in our movement. So we had Kane, the former wrestler Kane, Glenn Jacobs. We had Peter Schiff. We had Judge Napolitano. We had Ron Paul. And we had Hans Hoppe. We had others too, but Hans Hoppe was one of them. And when Hans's face appeared on that screen, that room absolutely erupted. And he was congratulating me on, all the work I had done over the years and that I should keep it up and keep smashing the enemy. And when he said those words, they went even crazier. So, I did an episode on Hans Hoppe years ago with Stefan Kinsella, who's a great student of Hans. And I said at the beginning of that episode that Hans is in some ways like Karl Marx, in that Karl Marx, both his admirers and his detractors share one thing in common. They've never read a word he wrote. They're arguing what they've heard other people say about him. They're arguing about what they think he believes. But they, you ask, what was, at least they might know the names of Marx's books. You ask somebody, well, what's the name of the most influential Hans Hoppe book? You might as well have asked them to speak to you in Chinese. So let's talk about books, for instance, because first of all, Hans he's an economist, but he's also a libertarian theorist and philosopher, and he's written widely on a variety of subjects in economics. Everything from Keynesianism to public goods theory. But he's also written about theoretical questions in economics, like in other words, the theory behind economics, the method of economics. So he's written, he's done work on positivism in the social sciences and why the Austrian method is to be preferred. So but he's also written works applying theory to history. He's done an awful lot. But you say he's an intellectual hero of yours. How did you get, to use a British expression, stuck into his work?
It was probably just going about things saying, I am interested in, just getting a lot of bang for my buck, whether I agree or disagree with it. I had come out of 12 years of government education and I was just so bored. I said, just at least give me something to love or hate. Just stop wasting my time. And when I came across how productive one short article, I want to say it's like this 4-page article, I think he titled it, The Ultimate Justification for the Private Property Ethic. It just completely lays out a totally coherent view of the world, whether you agree or disagree with it. And it's his intellectual explanation for argumentation ethics, saying by using violence or by using argument, we can extrapolate principles about how to act in, one, our everyday life, and two, what principles we should have for other people. So I think I just wanted to read a bunch of, I wanted to look at the smartest people I knew, see who they recommended. I came across a bunch of names. But once I started reading some of Hans Hoppe's work, I said, I feel like I'm getting a lot of bang for my buck. Every single page, I hear an argument that's totally new or learn a way of thinking or a concept. I was going through my notes of things that I wanted to bring up, and this one just really stood out to me. So right now, you have a lot of progressives who, for maybe the last 10, 20 years of their life, have been actively saying, we need to tax the rich more, the state needs to grow, they need more regulatory powers. And now this institution, which they have said needs more power and money, they're accusing it of committing genocide in Gaza. You'd think there'd be a little more moment of reflection about the nature of the state that they've been advocating the growth of for so long. They seem to think that there's, one point of view where the state is peaceful and that's what they want, and then there's a violent state which they're against. My favorite Hans Hoppe quote, if I had to say, is from Economy, Society, and History. He says, first, we should recognize that institutions such as states show a natural aggressiveness. The explanation is very simple. If you have to fund your own aggressive adventures yourself, out of your own pocket, that will somewhat curtail your natural inclination to fight other people because you have to pay for it yourself. On the other hand, if you imagine that if I want to fight some of you guys and I can tax him or ask him to support me in my fighting endeavors, then whatever my initial aggressive impulses might be are certainly stimulated because I can externalize the cost of war onto other people. I don't have to bear the cost myself. Other people have to bear the cost. This explains why institutions that have the power to tax and also institutions that have the power to print money in later ages have financial abilities that make it more likely that they will go to war than you would go to war if the power to tax was lacking or the power to print money was lacking on your part. Once I heard stuff like that, I'm just like, oh, well, of course, all the fights we see are between big governments, and it's not Americans and Russians are really wanting to go to war with each other, but the governments there to keep the peace are backing us away. It's always governments pushing populations into these conflicts. Brilliant ideas like that is what first made me come across Hans Hoppe and then get addicted to the stimulant.
Let me give away, or let me say what I think people should do in terms of reading, and then I'll share a few thoughts also. So the first book to read is A Theory of Socialism and Capitalism. The second book to read is The Economics and Ethics of Private Property. I don't care how boring that title sounds. The contents of that book will just knock your socks off because it explains the world. I mean, it basically explains why the world is the way it is and what the incentives are and why what we see is the natural outcome of that and then what we might do about it. And then only thirdly, Democracy, the God That Failed, even though that one is so juicy and it's so full of controversial things and you want to start there. But I say work your way up to that. That's the dessert. The meal, the meat and potatoes is the other two books. But I will say in the Democracy book, there's an insight that a lot of the sophisticated, and I say that mockingly, sophisticated libertarians didn't like hearing and they scoffed at. But it's actually a great insight about democracy versus monarchy. Now, Hans is not a monarch. He's not, and he doesn't support monarchy. But his point was this, that what you have with a democracy, think of it this way, what you have is a series of caretakers, temporary caretakers, who for 4 or 8 year terms are in charge of, the state apparatus. With a monarch, there's a different series of incentives because the monarch can hand the realm down to an heir. So in effect, he's like a private property owner. So what would you expect to happen? Now, it's true, you can get some crazy lunatic being the king. But as Hans says, you might also get a harmless dilettante, which you almost never do in a modern democracy. You always get some sinister person, and that person is presiding over a series of interest groups that are at war with the general good, and you can never seem to uproot any of them, and it's all that. But that doesn't seem to happen as much under monarchs, because they have no particular interest in destroying the country, saddling it with unpayable debt, engaging in total war that leads to widespread debt, death, and destruction, because then they're leaving a basket case to their heir. And so when you think about it that way, think about how would you govern if you knew your son was going to take over the thing someday, versus how would you govern if you knew you had 4 years only, or 8 years, and you want to do not necessarily what's in the long-term interest of the long-term capital value of the place, but you want to do short-term things that might, benefit your political party, that might make it more likely that your political party gets votes. What kinds of policies you expect to see? And then he goes and does a comparison. He said, well, let's look at some 19th century societies and let's compare them. Let's compare them in terms of size of the bureaucracy, size of the national debt. And he goes down and he says, it's exactly how you would expect it to be, that the incentives of democracy and the incentives of a monarch are not aligned because of this set of interests. Now, I know we're supposed, because we live in the United States, most people listening to this, so we laugh at how could people have been so foolish as to believe in a monarchy, ha, 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 ha. I get that, but you got to get all that out of your head for a minute and just think about what are the incentives of somebody who passes the realm down versus somebody who's just there on a temporary basis. It's like with a rental car. Nobody washes a rental car. Nobody gets an oil change for a rental car. And maybe you even very marginally drive the rental car more recklessly, even without realizing it. It's not yours. You don't have to deal with the long-term loss of the thing. But if that's your car, you're darn right you're going to go over that speed bump carefully. You're going to get that oil change at the regular time. You're going to put the top-notch gasoline in it if it calls for that. So that's just one of the many points that he makes in that book. But that's a valuable point. It really is. Doesn't mean you have to be a monarch. It means you have to understand. It's good to understand democracy better.
What immediately comes to mind for a lot of people who at least try to address this is, well, you libertarians are always saying the free market's good because there's competition, yet one of your guys is advocating not the competition of democracy, he's advocating monarchy, and you idiots just fell for this. Hoppe, of course, addresses this, where he says, what we want is competition in goods and not competition in bads. So it's very good to have competitions in who can make the best computer, who can serve the best food, who can provide the best service, who can provide the most fuel-efficient car. What's not good is to have competition in bads. We do not want to have a competition in who can kidnap the most people. Let's have a competition on that. That would be competition in bads, in which you would incentivize more bad things to happen. He says, he makes a very good point in the book where he says, the average person does not have the time to get so involved in politics, to do all the research and inform themselves on Ukraine, Gaza, antitrust, minimum wage laws, agricultural subsidies, the truth about Herbert Hoover's administration. That's just too much. So what do? They listen to someone who can sort of arouse the passions of the feeble-minded, and that tends to be the demagogues who promise ever more and more increasing encroachments on the private property rights of other people. They promise you more and more and more. I mean, I cannot imagine that anyone today, looking at the current situation, I think the government spent $6.27 trillion in 2022. Their approach to this is the government doesn't have enough money. And meanwhile, we have someone who, for 2 years, President Biden, didn't care to call Vladimir Putin or Sergei Lavrov while waging a proxy war against Russia. 6,000 nukes, didn't care to call the other person. These are people with such a high time preference. I don't know how much they think about the next week or the next month or the next year. You see this totally psychotic behavior as a causal result of democracy. One of my favorite quotes from the book. There are those who recognize correctly that the problem lay with monopoly, not with elites or nobility, but they were far outnumbered by those who erroneously blamed it on the elitist character of the rulers instead, and who accordingly strove to maintain the monopoly of law and law enforcement and merely replace the king and the visible royal pomp by the people and the presumed modesty and decency of the common man, hence the historic success of democracy. So he says, people thought the problem with kings is the crown and the palace and the carelessness and the pomp. The reality is they had a monopoly on the judicial system. They were the final arbiter in all cases, in all disputes, including disputes with the crown itself. So this is the problem that he's trying to bring to light. I love that book.
Folks, I get a lot done every day, but in order to do that, I need to be efficient. And sometimes when you're trying to be efficient and you're pressed for time, well, you make bad eating choices. But Factor has chef-made gourmet meals that make eating well easy. They're ready to heat and eat in about 2 minutes, so you can feel right and feel great no matter what life throws at you. Factor arrives fresh and fully prepared with 40 options across 8 dietary preferences on the menu each week. It's easy to pick meals tailored to your goals. You can choose from preferences like Calorie Smart, Protein Plus, or Keto. And you can lose up to 8 pounds in 8 weeks with Factor Keto meals based on a randomized controlled clinical trial with Factor Keto. Results will vary depending on diet and exercise. And it's not just dinner, by the way. Factor can help you feel your best all day long with wholesome smoothies, breakfasts, grab-and-go snacks, and more add-ons. Reach your goals this year with ingredients you can trust and convenience that can't be beat. Eat smart with Factor. Get started at factormeals.com/Woods50off and use code Woods50off to get 50% off your first box plus free shipping. That's code Woods50off at factormeals.com/Woods50off to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first box. All right, let's talk about now. I went back and listened to the Stephan Kinsella episode, and he corrected me in an area where he shouldn't have corrected me. I now realize. I was telling him that Hans is excellent on the so-called public goods argument. Now he agrees with me on that, of course, but there are certain category. There's a certain category of goods that can't be provided by the free market, and they satisfy certain criteria, and that's how we can identify them as public goods. And Hans points out that the whole model of that is just sloppy. It's obviously just an after-the-fact rationalization of what the state wants to do anyway. There is actually no way to isolate these particular goods as being public goods, and he explains this whole thing. But that is, so we were talking about the book, A Theory of Socialism and Capitalism, and Stephan said, oh, well, that's not in that book. That's in another book. Wrong, Stephan. Chapter 10 is on public goods. Hans is great on this. You've never seen a treatment of public goods like Hans's in any economics textbook. That's for sure. But let's say a brief thing, even though I've done an episode on this, and it is controversial, and he does have critics on this, but he also, there are also responses to the critics. We'll just say a little something about argumentation ethics, because the idea of that, stated very simply, is if you and I are standing there arguing about what the best, let's say what the best social system is, and I'm arguing for a pure private property society, and you're arguing for some alternative, Hans would say there's something, I hate to use the word meta, but there's something fundamental about the framework of our very argument that speaks volumes. He says, notice that we're not trying to resolve this matter by clocking each other over the head. What are we doing? We're standing here reasoning to see who has the more persuasive argument. And indeed, in standing there, we are presuming that the opponent we're talking to has the right to his body, which he's using, and his vocal cords, which he's using to argue with. This is presumed in the course of an argument. If it weren't, it would be a physical altercation, but it's not. We're not. We understand that if we're having an argument, that one person has his bodily integrity and uses it to advance his claims, and is also entitled to standing room. Again, we presume that this is with the consent of the owner, but these features of argumentation, he says, if we extrapolate from the norms that we take for granted when we're arguing, we realize that these are actually the norms of a private property society, and that we're implicitly agreeing to them in the very course of arguing with each other. Now, there are people who've said, oh, well, it can't be that simple, Hans. Oh, yeah, I've got 27 caveats to this. and I don't mean to ridicule everybody who's been a critic. I have dear friends who've been a critic of Hans on this. But what Murray Rothbard loved about it was just a hardcore approach. He said, my own natural rights approach seems positively wimpy compared to this robust assertion by Hans Hoppe.
Yeah, taking something that people already engage in necessarily, much like it seems very highly motivated by Mises's starting point with economics. He's like, all right, before discussing gross domestic product, let's start with the fact that humans act. Can we at least agree on that? And you could say, no, humans don't act, but you're engaged in a performative contradiction. So by the very nature of engaging in argumentation, he refers to it as employing the scarce resources of one's body that they've rightly acquired through homesteading. Not because I worked really hard to be born. You could say, you are the homesteader of your body. Therefore, with regard to others, you have a better claim to it. And he just takes that principle and extrapolates it. This is very different than someone who just inherently believes in democracy. And most people who believe in democracy, that necessarily means that the vast majority of governments that have ever existed are inherently illegitimate. So they're almost with us in the case against the state there. What I think is really important in a theory of socialism and capitalism is when he defines the terms that he's going about. So he says capitalism, a lot of people would just associate it. Capitalism means greed, dog eat dog, and making a lot of money. The problem with this immediately is, are politicians and teachers a bunch of unpaid volunteers? Are people in socialist societies totally equal in the amount of social status and the amount of monetary assets that they have with regard to their populations? Of course not. There's inequality, there's exploitation in all these socialist regimes. So how can we actually define this? He defines capitalism as a social system based on the explicit recognition of private property and non-aggressive contractual exchanges with private property owners. Communism is the abolition of private property, and socialism is the degree of aggressiveness against the private property ethic. He defines it, the institutionalized aggression against private property. That's his brief explanation of socialism. So this rightly addresses what National Socialism and democratic socialism have in common. This is why they're immoral. They have a certain degree of aggressiveness against private property and contractual exchanges with private property owners. So really getting a good definition is what I really, is something that really helped me see a lot of policies much more clearly than I otherwise would have. And with this principled hatred of the state, it makes it much more likely to get people on board, I think, because as he says, you can always say, well, that didn't work that time because that was Castro's vision of it. Well, that was Stalin's vision of it. Well, that was Napoleon's vision of such a thing. But hating the state on the principle that it's a naturally aggressive entity seeking to maintain a monopoly on law and order, that's what makes it immoral. That's what makes it economically inefficient, because it doesn't engage with the principle of contractual obligations with others.
You know, let me say a little something here about Hans and he has an article called Marxist and Austrian Class Analysis. I'm almost sure that's the name of it. And the gist of it is this. He says that Marxist analysis is wrong because it pinpoints the wrong sources, the wrong source of injustice, but it's not wrong in saying that there's injustice. And you know, now in this day and age where we have to deal with people who use this ridiculous expression, the woke right, you're woke right if you say that, you know, there are classes that are antagonistic to each other, or there are groups that are antagonistic to each other, or whatever, because you're just like Marx. Okay, but you know what? The classical liberals had class analysis before there was a Karl Marx. That was their idea. But Hans's point would be to say that the relevant classes are the oppressed proletariat and the oppressing bourgeoisie is just blockheaded. What the classical liberals said about class, which we know, and this is Ralph Raico has a great study of this from the 19th century, but they looked at it in terms of your relationship with the state. And so you had, in effect, what John C. Calhoun talked about, the tax consumer and the taxpayer. That there's one group that is getting benefits at the expense of another group, coerced benefits at the expense of another group. That is an abusive relationship. That is an abusive class relationship. That I belong to the class of taxpayer and you belong to the class of tax consumer. So the entire bureaucracy that's sitting around doing God knows what all day, they are tax consumers. And if I'm going to think in terms of classes, which there's no inherent reason that should be bad. There's nothing wrong with thinking that way as long as you identify the right ones. There's nothing wrong with thinking about friends and enemies as long as you identify the right people in each category. And so Hans says, look, there is exploitation in the world. So Marx is right about that. But he is silly to say that the exploitation is occurring when the proletariat is employed for, quote, less than the value of their labor and all that. He says, no, the capitalist serves a purpose. The capitalist advances them the money that they get in their wages so they don't have to sit around and wait the 6 months for the goods they produce to actually be sold to the end consumer. They could do that. They could quit their jobs and they could run their own business and they could sit around and not have income until all their work is done and the product sells to the general public. Most people are a little bit more impatient than that. So they would rather allow the capitalist a small premium in exchange for being advanced the money now. That's simply time preference. That's the economic principle of time preference. I'd rather have that money that today than the same sum of money at some point in the indefinite future. And so, yes, there is exploitation. Marx is right to say that there's exploitation, but he's wrong in that he's wrong in where he pinpoints the exploitation. The exploitation is the state versus everybody else. The state exploits everybody else by interacting with everybody coercively and expropriating people and taking property without their consent, or taking property violently, in effect, or with the threat of violence. That's exploitation, not voluntary labor contracts. Exploitation is when there's no voluntary aspect to it whatsoever. And so he continues to go through various layers of Marxist analysis to say it's not that the analysis is absolutely wrong. It's that in every single case, you can rely on this guy to be so wrong-headed that he gets the protagonists and antagonists all wrong. So there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. That happens to be right. So that's a very interesting. In fact, I have a friend who is a recovering Marxist. I handed him this article by Hans Hoppe, and it really helped him. It really helped us. All right, so I did sense something was wrong with the world, yes. And I was not wrong to sense that something was wrong with the world. And I was not wrong to sense that some groups are screwing the hell out of other groups. I just misidentified them. Hey, folks, it's a fact that what Austrian economists call low time preference, that means a willingness to defer gratification and plan for the future, has been an essential factor in the emergence of civilization. Well, one way you can be part of that civilizing process is by getting life insurance, so your family's needs will be met in the future in case anything should happen to you. I myself have tremendous peace of mind because I've arranged for just that. And Policy Genius is the place to go. Policy Genius's technology lets you compare quotes from America's top insurers in just a few clicks to find your lowest price. They're the country's leading online insurance marketplace, and you can rely on them for unbiased advice. As a matter of fact, with Policy Genius, you can find life insurance policies that start at just $292 per year for $1 million of coverage. Some options are 100% online and let you avoid unnecessary medical exams. It's super easy to use, and they've generated thousands of fantastic reviews. Secure your families tomorrow so you have peace of mind today. Head to policygenius.com or click the link in the description or on the show notes page to get your free life insurance quotes and see how much you could save. That's policygenius.com.
That was definitely one that really woke me up. If you say that the problem is the people who are engaging contractually and the people who are really on your side are the proletarians who are ready to riot at any point, people like Luigi who are willing to assassinate people. You need to really ally with those people, not businessmen who have drastically decreased the cost of products and services and given you access to more goods and services your grandparents could have ever dreamed of. No, by offering you a product or service, they are exploiting you. That's the real villain in the world. Well, if the problem is, well, they're taking your surplus value, but it doesn't address the fact that it's voluntary. By this metric, every stay-at-home mom is exploiting the surplus value of her husband. If you work for a company that's not profitable, you're exploiting their surplus value because they're not profiting off your labor, you're profiting off them. It is just so absolutely ridiculous that people ever fell for this. And the ones making the case for egalitarianism and the importance of equality and not having too much institutional power with some people rather than others, well, I guess they just hate the idea that there's a natural aristocracy, that some people are just better than others. Very few people can sing a song as good as Adele. Very few people are as funny as Jerry Seinfeld. Also, very few people are as brilliant as Jeff Bezos or Steve Jobs and can run a company as efficiently that can produce so much wealth for so many people. So I guess this hatred of egalitarianism, which he has an interesting insight on, it might have originally come from Lew Rockwell, but he summarizes it great in Getting Libertarianism Right. He says, the egalitarian doctrine achieved this status, not because it is true, but because it provides the perfect intellectual cover for the drive toward totalitarian social control by a ruling elite. In other words, egalitarianism's impossible. So at any point in history, so long as humans exist, with the natural inequality among man, there's always going to be inequality, which means there will always be another justification to grow the state. Could you have imagined explaining to socialists, like the George Bernard Shaw socialists of the world, hey, by the year 2024, the government is going to be heavily democratic and it's going to spend trillions of dollars a year in welfare. He would have thought this was the fact that this is happening in America, the evil capitalist, colonialist America. What a victory. Turns out they are less grateful than ever before. You never get thanked for paying your taxes. To even talk about school choice is to be so evil. You just want to defund schools. They're so ungrateful in this strive towards egalitarianism that you end up with massive inequality between the rulers and the ruled, and they're not even happy about it. So the fool's errand of egalitarianism, the idiocy of Marx's exploitation theory of the world, I thought is very vitally important as well.
It's interesting that you make that point about egalitarianism being something that the state apparatus and the people in it don't necessarily believe in. It's just that that's an idea that empowers them to intervene in our lives forever, because the ideal, so-called, will never be reached. Because that was Sam Francis's view, and Sam Francis is like an ancestor of the I don't know, the new right or whatever term it is. He was a newspaper columnist who had hard right positions, and he said his view was nobody believes in egalitarianism. Like absolutely nobody. This is a charade. They claim to believe in it, but they know it's false. But it sure gives them sinecures and privilege and positions of power. And some people weren't quite sure. Some people thought, I do think some people do believe in egalitarianism. Some of them really do believe in it, but others, no doubt, are cynically manipulating, others through this idea. So tell me what else you got in your notes, because I don't want to let your notes go to waste. I mean, you put time into those notes.
Well, I loved his this quote from The Libertarian Quest for a Grand Historical Narrative. So he says, because the general public is not used to or capable of abstract reasoning, high theory, and intellectual consistency, but forms its political views and convictions on the basis of historical narratives, i.e., of prevailing interpretations of past events, it is upon those who want to change things for the better, liberal, libertarian future, to challenge and correct such interpretations and propose and promote alternative revisionist historical narratives. the guy who immediately comes to mind is Bert Folsom, how he totally changed the way I saw all of history rather than, well, there were the rich and the poor. You hear Elon Musk has been called a robber baron more times than I think I've ever heard Vanderbilt called it just in the last couple weeks. Bezos, another robber baron. And what makes them a robber baron? When they're very rich, and the rich are the bad group. Folsom says we need to differentiate between market entrepreneurs and political entrepreneurs. People who gain their wealth as a causal result of contract, lowering prices and getting a bigger mass market for things. This includes Henry Ford's work with the Model T, John D. Rockefeller drastically decreasing the price of oil, Cornelius Vanderbilt giving people access to steamship and railroad travel that only kings of the past had access to. Today, people like Steve Jobs and Jeff Bezos, who have gained, and Sam Walton, who have gained a lot of wealth and high status as a causal result of providing not yachts to billionaires, but products and services that everyone really appreciates and are able to increase their material well-being. So that was another one. The importance of us having a theory of history and a way to analyze historical events.
What do you recommend people do? They say, I'm interested in this Hans Hoppe guy. What should the first step they take be? Actually, you know what? Let's pause that question. We'll come back to that question. Right now, the Libertarian Institute, which does great work, it published, among other things, my book, Diary of a Psychosis, and made my life 1 billion times easier thereby. It's run by Scott Horton and several other people we all love. Say a word about that and what's going on there, and let's get back to Hans Hoppe.
Right now, the Libertarian Institute is having our 2025 fundraiser. This allows us to have Scott Horton take 2 years to write an 800-page book, Provoked, explaining the origins of the current proxy war between the nuclear powers taking place in Ukraine and Russia. Unfortunately, it takes about 2 years for something like that to get written, and we have to pay the bills in the meantime. But it resulted in one of my favorite debates ever, where Scott Horton was able to get on the Piers Morgan show and debate General Wesley Clark and ask him about his 7 countries in 5 years comment that he made on Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman. If you don't know what that is, check out the debate between Scott Horton and Wesley Clark. What we're doing at the Libertarian Institute is trying to bring people together and have a free educational archive in one website on history, economics, philosophy, and the news of the day. Kyle Anzalone summarizes the news in about 6 bullet points every single day. We have people like Joe Salas Mullins writing a book, The National Debt and You. He also wrote The Fake China Threat. We have Connor Freeman constantly analyzing the issues going on with Ukraine, China, what's happening in Gaza, what's happening in Israel. We want to provide a place where anyone can go, type in the name, Winston Churchill, type in the topic, minimum wage, and get the libertarian point of view in a very short amount of time. We want to save people on monetary cost and, more importantly, opportunity cost. You don't have to spend $50,000 a year for 4 years to learn about these very important things. They can be summarized in audio, video, and article and blog format. So if you're interested in helping people see the world clearly, libertarianinstitute.org.
And I'll just say, before you jump back into Hans Hoppe, I sit on the board. They're great people. Nobody's riding around in a limousine with the money. Believe me, I've been to Scott Horton's house. Okay, he is not spending your money on luxurious living. The money goes to the ideas that we believe in. So all right. So let's get back to libertarianinstitute.org/donate. Probably, I think you said. Just go do that. I love these people. They're 100,000% trustworthy. We all love Scott. And these things don't run automatically. So if you're in the market for helping somewhere, that would be a great place to do it. So,
Scott worked very hard to get us a 501c3 status, so you can write this off on your taxes too. That's what makes it so great. You get to stick it to them just a little bit by donating to us. Every now and then you're able to find a little loophole in this evil lattice work of statism that allows us to fund things we really like and write it off on our taxes. So yes, libertarianinstitute.org/donate. Thank you for letting me plug that.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. All right. So what's your recommendation? I want to look into this Hoppe guy and not just, the three sentences of his, the demonic sentences that have been quoted to me. I want to actually read the guy. What would you recommend? It doesn't have to be mine. What would you recommend people start?
If I had to pick, if people want to start somewhere, if you go to Mises.org, there's a book titled Hoppe Unplugged, and it's a very short book with just his biggest quotes from a gentleman who really admires his work. That's a great place to start. The best book, I would say, is titled The Great Fiction. It's a collection of Hoppe essays, very wide-ranging. They could be read in any order. I'd say big book is The Great Fiction, inspired by Bastiat, which Hoppe produced. And if you don't have much time, you're still on the fence, check out Hoppe Unplugged. I think it's $3 at the Mises Institute store.
All right. So that is, in fact, why don't I link to that also on the show notes page and beneath the video. So tomwoods.com/2608 will be where we'll put that. And any final word here? Have you met Hans before yourself in person?
No, I haven't. Kinsella was nice enough to give him a copy of the Voluntarist Handbook, and he took a picture with it, but I have not met him. Very jealous, though. But I get to meet him every single day with all the books I've acquired of his.
Fair enough. And you never know when he'll make it back to the U.S. So anyway, tomwoods.com/2608 is the link. libertarianinstitute.org/donate. Go help these guys. They're great. They're not going to let you down. They don't blow the money. These big foundations, you don't know what in heaven's name is going on over there, but I can attest to the honesty and decency of these folks over at the Libertarian Institute. So thank you, Keith Knight, for joining us today and also for the good work you do with the Libertarian Institute.
Tom Woods, thanks so much for having me.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Make yourself and those you love less vulnerable to the regime, both mentally and physically. Get more forbidden information at tomsfreebooks.com and be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you listen. See you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.